Hello, and welcome to the Hub Cymru Africa podcast. My name is Catherine Longa, and I am the host. This is the podcast where we talk about Wales Africa community and the global solidarity sector. It's recorded with support from the FCDO under the Small Charities Challenge Fund, as well as Welsh Government. In particular, this podcast is looking at Reframing the Narrative project, which has been run with the Sub-Sahara Advisory Panel and Hub Cymru Africa, looking at challenging racism and stereotypical narratives and images and stories within the charity sector. Hub Cymru Africa does a range of work. We help with fundraising, we give one-to-one advice, we organise network and training events, and everything that we do for you, all the support that we give is free. So you can get in touch with us if you have any questions or need any advice. The email address is advice@hubcymruafrica.org.uk. Okay, but now this podcast. I am delighted to welcome Faith Israel, my colleague from Sub-Saharan Advisory Panel. Hi, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I guess I'm Faith Israel. I work as the Diaspora and Inclusion Officer for the Sub-Sahara Advisory Panel, and a lot of my work is also with Hub Cymru Africa.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you very much for recording the interview today that follows on from our kind of work together on reframing the narrative. Can you tell us what we can expect? Who did you meet and what can we expect from the podcast today?
So I had a chat with Takura, who was one of the judges on the Reframing the Narrative photography competition that we recently ran. And we just had a really great discussion around consent and looking at consent with regards to images and taking photos for organisations and for people doing work in global solidarity. And Takura shared so many points and great things around consent and things to consider. And we've had a great chat.
Lovely. I'm really looking forward to listening to this. Thank you very much. Let's go.
Right. Hi, Takura. Welcome. Thank you for meeting me today, this Saturday morning, actually. Very much appreciated. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Faith. So, hi, I'm Takura. I am one of the judges on a photo competition we've been running, entitled Reframing the Narrative, and that was with Hub Cymru and SSAP. The other two judges that are on the panel are Edwards and Justice Kalebe. It's great to be here with you, Faith, this morning.
Thank you. So I think we wanted to start with talking maybe about power, in terms of power with photography and who's holding the power and how that can change or be given or taken. Is there anything that you would like to start on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is one of the things that we noticed from the photographs that we received, the entries that we got. There's just a whole lot of power dynamics going on in the pictures. And more generally speaking, this happens a lot with photographs. So you've got subjects in the photos who are a lot of the times kind of just subject to whatever the photographer wants to do within those photographs. So with these photos, what we noticed was there's a couple of really good ones where that power is shifted more towards the subject, and then there's also the other side of it where you can see that the narrative is strongly controlled by the photographer. So the story is kind of tilted one way. So I think on the whole, my general thoughts on this are that photographers, when they've got their cameras up to their eye and they're taking a picture of something, whatever's in the frame, they hold a lot of power in doing that. And at times, I think people can be more cautious. People can be not just cautious, but also conscious of what that looks like and be responsible with that power, so that it's not just, whatever I've got, what I think should be within the frame, that's the story. Because as you probably know, how you tell a story is very important. It affects how people are going to receive it. It affects how they're also going to be able to see it. So that's one thing that I think I just thought we should highlight, that power dynamic in those photographs when somebody is actually controlling what that image looks like.
Yeah, and I guess so. I'm kind of curious to know, how do you think the photographer practically can be conscious of this power when they are taking their photos? What things should they be aware of, or can they do?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think is easy to do is in that moment actually just being aware of what the story is, and how you can be as truthful as possible to that story. A lot of times you're confronted with something that is, it's something that you're looking at and it's there. That story, it looks like, whatever it is that you're seeing there, that's the story in the moment. But sometimes if you're going to just dig a little bit deeper, speak to people, ask certain questions, and if they are open enough to actually tell you their stories, then you might find that there's a lot more to the first scene that you saw than you thought there was to it. So just being cautious enough to say, look, I've got a great image in front of me, yes, but maybe before I conclude that this is the entire story, maybe speak to a couple of people. And this doesn't even have to be something that you're doing before you take the photograph. Sometimes you feel like I've got a photograph in front of me, I want to take it, and you take that photo, but it doesn't mean you need to stop there. I have conversations with people, ask them a bit more about whatever it is that you were involved in at that point in time, find out if there's more to it, and then try and also just include those other facets in probably more photographs, and then you probably will have a more truthful and more balanced story at the end of it.
And I guess, so when you said that, I feel like, I imagine, anyway, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine that people could be on quite strict time constraints, or may only have, an hour to collect their photos and then go and, send this off to, the rest of the team. What would you say to those people who maybe feel like, actually, I don't have enough time to have these conversations, I just want to get my photo and I just want to go?
Yeah, you're definitely right. There's a lot of situations like that, especially if what you're doing is more along the lines of documentary work. In such cases, I think there's two things here. I think as long as someone is aware that they have produced a photograph, and whatever photograph that they've produced is about someone else, it's someone else's story, so to speak, and you haven't had the time to actually speak to whoever that photograph is of, then you can either try and reach out to them after the fact. That might be very difficult, but I think it's still very much worth it. I mean, if you're being ethical about your use of those photographs in the aftermath, then I think it's definitely something that you should actively do. And in the event that you can't, and you can't get permission to use the photograph, then my best recommendation is actually, no matter how great the photograph is, don't use it. Because at the end of the day, this is somebody else's life that you're getting to paint a certain way. And like I was saying before, people need to be responsible with that power, that ability to actually use photographs in a certain way to tell a certain story. But those people are not, they're subjects in photographs, but they're not subject to you. So beyond that photograph, those people have got lives, they've got livelihoods, and as best as you can, it's better not to tamper with that, but also just to protect the dignity of, especially in more vulnerable situations, of those people. So if you can't get the permission for it, my own recommendation is, it might be a great photo, yes, but actually don't use it because you haven't got permission to actually go on and use it.
Yeah. And I feel like in that you kind of touched on something that I think we've spoken about previously, which is consent and how things might be legal or allowed, but that balance of thinking about, okay, what are the ethics around this? How can you be considerate as a photographer, even though this may be, there may be guidance that says this is fine, or there may be no guidance. I feel like there's such a layered nature to consent. I think especially in our competition that we've had, we've seen, you know, discussions around child protection, for example. I don't know if you've got anything to say on that area of power and consent as well.
Yes, absolutely. And those are very, very important things that you're highlighting there. Consent is a very, very big thing when it comes to documentary style photographs or photojournalism. I think consent is really about taking consideration of as much facets of your work as possible. Not just your work in isolation from who it is about, but also how it goes on to affect the subject of your photographs. So I think at the basis of it, it is a yes or no thing when you tear everything down and come to what's basically consent. But I think it's more than just the yes, is the reasons behind that, and also the no's very equally. Why someone might say, I don't want you to use this photograph. And it's those considerations that I think photographers themselves need to have when they are approaching subjects. It happens that sometimes you get a great photo and you think it needs to be out there, and you approach the subject of the photo and they say no. And I think photographers should always walk away from the situation feeling that they have done what they were supposed to do. Beyond me as a photographer being supposed to put out the photograph, I think there's the responsibility to actually engage the subject in what I'm doing. So I think that is a core of consent. You're speaking about the legality and what's allowed in terms of taking photos, and in some areas that's a very gray space, and there might not be a lot of clear guidance on it. But what I think is always paramount, is always very important, is that before I actually use the photograph for anything, and this is what I'm saying, sometimes you take a photo and then afterwards you have to consider these things. I think it's always important to actually go back and say, well, if there is no guidance, and I haven't strictly been told that I can't do this, should I still do it? Is it really... Well, I mean, to be honest with you, sometimes it's a simple question like, you know what happens if I actually don't use this photograph? What is the purpose of this photograph? And am I serving it well by going on to use it, despite all the other things which are unseemly about me using that photograph? So that is always something that, some photographers will have an inner dialogue about and say, well, I think this is important work because it shows the reality of the situations and so forth. But again, that person who is in your photograph, those people who are in your photographs, they are people. They're not just numbers to add to the evidence of what is there, what you could see, Yeah. So I think that's where that falls in terms of getting consent for that.
Yeah, I think, it's so important to remember that, like you said, these are people, and in this moment they might be your subject, but they are people with lives, before and after the person who's photographing them has come along. And I think, that's such an important thing to remember. And I guess I was wondering, is there, for photographers who may be working in areas that don't have laws or just guidance around taking photographs, is there a place that people can go, especially for people who perhaps are slightly newer in this field? Is there somewhere that people can go to find, like, okay, generally these are the standards that we try to abide by?
Yeah, there are some. I mean, there are some ethically held standards within the profession itself. Now, I appreciate what you just said there in the end, which is that for some people who are actually approaching this and are trying to get to know what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, I think there's a lot of documentation floating out on the internet. But more than this might not be precisely what you're asking me, but I think it is important, because I think more than what you've got on paper which says you're allowed to do, I think the more important thing is the context-specific consideration of what is there on the ground. And we've spoken before about engaging the actual subjects to say, like, I feel like I want to use this for A, B, C, D, right? Speaking explicitly about that, making sure that people understand exactly what you intend to use your photographs for. I think that will always trump any document that you're introduced to. Because sometimes you will come across ethical standards which are not necessarily aligned to the context that you're actually working in, right? And it means totally different things for those people. So there are no broad guidances on what can you and what can't you do with photographs or while you're taking photos, etc., etc. But I think that there are things that, like, we're socially always kind of obligated to observe. And I think those are more powerful pillars for us to like point to say, okay, look, I want to clearly tell a story, but it is a story of other people. And is it fair if I actually go on to tell that story without even speaking to them? How am I sure that I know all the things that pertain to the story if I'm just going to use a photograph? So such questions, I think they're definitely going to help any standards that somebody might be able to come across. And like I said, there's a lot of these, a lot of documentation on ethics in photojournalism and so forth that people can actually look up. But my sense is that, you know, the biggest pillar that you can hold on to is just being conscious of the possible impact of your work, and then taking the necessary steps to actually engage the people that you're photographing before you then go on to use those photos.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I feel like that's actually quite well, at least to me, it sounds like such a good rule of thumb in terms of being very explicit about what you want to use that photo for. You know, making sure that whilst, you know, you might be taking it in one context, if you have plans to use it in a different way, that whoever is in that photo knows that and is consenting to that as well, not just their photo being taken.
Yeah.
I guess also this is something that we have discussed throughout this competition, which is around the issue of child protection, where, you know, it might be somebody below like a legal age that can provide their consent. How do you think then it differs when we're talking now about young children?
Children are very, very unique because they're very vulnerable. And because they're very vulnerable, it's very important that when you are taking images of them, you get explicit consent from the right people to actually give that consent. I think with especially some of the images that you're referring to in the competition, you're thinking about, well, this child in the future, if they're looking at this image themselves, how are they going to feel about that image, which is from really a human dignifying point of view. But also, across the board, I just think that if you're going to take a photo of a child, then you need to have permission for it from their legal guardian or their parents. And that to me is just, again, going back to what we're talking about in terms of ethical practice. Not putting yourself in a position where you can take advantage of the power dynamic between you and the child, right? I mean, if it's an adult, sometimes you come into a place and you put up your camera and that person immediately says, no, I don't want you to take a photo of me, right? So that's more frequent with adults. But with children now, because they're very much probably going to be fearful in terms of speaking up for themselves, but also just because, it's a camera and it's this machine and you're there doing whatever it is you're doing, they might not even see you in that whole process. Yeah. So all of those vulnerabilities are the things that I think need to play into the photographer's own responsibility to say, well, yeah, this child is part of this photograph, part of this story, but also they need to be protected within that story, and approaching the right people to then give you the permission or deny you the permission when it comes to you actually being able to use those photographs.
I guess as well, on the same kind of thread, what about future consent in terms of maybe potentially withdrawing consent after the fact or after the image has been taken?
Yes, so this is probably one of the more difficult things. Possibly because it's very, very specific to the scenarios that this can happen in. You do have cases where after people have given their consent initially, they decide to withdraw that consent and say, actually, for one reason or another, I don't want this to be out there anymore. And in certain places, that right is self-guided by certain laws, right? And I can decide today that I don't want my data to be still used for something, and then so in some cases that is there, in other cases it's not. And I think this is one of those places where dialogue with photographers is necessary from a general understanding point of view. I mean, if there's any such thing as one human being to another, I think this is one of those places where it would be very, very useful. Because at the end of the day, the consideration is that in the first place, when I gave you the consent, we were in a specific context. And possibly that context is no longer there. Now I'm coming back to a photographer asking them to withdraw use of that photograph for whatever reason. But really, I am asking. And in such a case, my view has always been that, whoever is asking is they're kind of like doing the reverse of what the photographer did in the first place. Now they are asking for something to be done, right? And you can get a no from the photographer. Sometimes you will get a no. Sometimes there's just no way in which you can actually withdraw that consent. But from the photographer's point of view, especially ones that are working in more vulnerable situations, etc., I think that for me, that is what ethics is about. It's about going beyond the legal or whatever is on paper that you had gotten initially. I think there has to be, like I've just been reiterating the whole time, just the consideration of people's livelihoods, and just thinking, well, you know what, maybe I used this photograph to tell a certain story at a specific time, and that was very important then, and we did that, right? But at this point in time, is it worth actually, this drift now between me and the then subject of the photo? Because that is essentially what it becomes then. It becomes again a different form of power struggle between the photographer and the subject of the photo, just in future. So I strongly feel that in such cases where it is way after somebody has given their initial consent, then the photographer has to do a lot more considering, probably more than they did initially.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, no, that's very true, very true. And I guess we've spoken already about like explicit consent and really being open about what it is you're using the photo for. I guess my mind is now going to perhaps some of the unintentional harms that can be caused when the consent isn't informed. Like you said, if you strip it back, it is just a yes or no. But in reality, there are so many layers to this. And so I guess I'm kind of curious about that informed element in consent in terms of like, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, so informed consent, to me at least, very much relates to being specific, being very specific about intended uses, being very specific about intended audiences, being very specific also about intended times of usage. So I think, one of the things that usually happens is that someone asks for permission to take a photo, right? And someone says, yeah, sure, go on. You can take a photograph, right? Without necessarily explaining what you want to use the photo for, when you want to use the photo, for how long you want to use the photo. But then the photographer says, I got permission to take the photo. But I mean, if you're looking at the situation, are you being fair to the person who said, yes, you can take a photo of me? Because me saying yes in that moment wasn't really informed. It was on the fly, on the go. You approached me, and in my very welcoming sense, I said yes. I was like, that's very okay with me. You can take a photograph. But then now you're going on to actually do the exact opposite of the nature of the relationship that we had before. So I think informed consent, whether it is written or it is verbal, whatever the case is, and with verbal cases, mind you, I think I've mentioned this to you before. I think it is just good if the photographer or whoever is responsible for getting that consent actually has a recording or something of that going on. But it has to be, like we're saying, it has to be informed consent. All of those things, the uses and the timelines for use, I think they need to be very, very clear. The audiences, they need to be very, very clear to the subjects of the photographs to say that this is the situation. This is all of the things that are pertaining to future use of this photograph. And then getting someone to say yes to you, which is a bit daunting because I think, to be fair, every time you do that, you just run the risk of the person realizing so many more things and then saying no. And I think this is why photographers tend to be like, I think, let me just say that I would like to take a photo of them and then just say a couple of things and then they move away from it. Yeah. But it's very necessary to at least be very frank on if you already know what that intended use is going to be. If you don't know, when you do know what you're going to be using that photo for, please just go back. Whatever ways in which you can, whether it's going to be messaging them, giving them a call, reaching out to them through some third party and so forth. But as long as there's just a clear record of you communicating with the people that you want to go on to make use of that photograph, I think that works well.
No, that's it's good to be able to break these things down. I think sometimes we can, just say buzzwords like informed consent and just leave it at that without actually really talking about what that looks like. So it's really good to actually hear that from you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now I'm just thinking how, a big part of the work we do at Hub Cymru Africa is around narratives and reframing the narratives. And so I think I'd like to talk a little bit about that as well, in terms of, when a photographer is, going into a space and they're taking pictures, maybe it's for their own organization or personal use or a competition, even like ours. I think it would be great to talk more about like how the photographer controls the narrative. in terms of how they take the photo, and then it's just up to them, really.
This is just this great sense of power that comes with being able to be the one who takes the photograph. Narratives are a very topical issue now, for one reason or another. But the sense of who's the hero in a story, because these are stories that we're telling at the end of the day, the sense of who's the hero, I think tends to be, unfortunately, because of the nature of photography, tends to be in the hands of the photographer. I think it's like this very, very proverb, which I've come across everywhere now, says that until a lion learns to write its own story, the story will always glorify the hunter. So I think it is a lot like that. Partially just given the nature of photography, I take the photo, I decide where it's going to go, I decide how it's going to be consumed in a lot of cases. And in a lot of times as well, you usually don't have the subject there in those places where the photograph is being shown, but you usually have the photographer there, right? So even then, they're still kind of controlling what the story is and so forth. So I think we've been talking about the responsibilities of the photographer, and this is one of them. Just being as honest as you can about the photographs, right? Trying not to be biased, first of all, to your own objectives with the photograph. Trying to be, we say, truthful to the situation, but also the wider story around it, as we mentioned before. I think narratives on the whole they're very difficult to control. And this is why you can easily change them on any one story. If you're trying hard enough. And because they're not fixed things, a lot of times with photographs, this is how you end up with like problematic photographs that people maybe years later then go on to say, oh, that wasn't so good, even though it was an interesting photo when it was taken, and it wins awards, right? But then later on, people are looking at the situation and they're saying, times have changed and that probably isn't so great now. And that happens a lot. Like a photograph just is a snapshot in time, right? But time moves on. So I think that as long as the photographers involved are very aware that that narrative that they are telling or that they intend to tell is not a fixed thing, it helps as well. Because even in future, if then you come across a situation where one of the photos that you took or some of your work is definitely against what standards are, then you always know that from the very get-go, I had an open mind about how this could be received. But your chances of that happening are just much less if, to begin with, you try to tell the story from the other person's point of view instead of your own. So I think that it's just one of the ways in which you can try to safeguard. There's definitely not going to be any solid means which you can use to just safeguard yourself from what the future looks like, but just trying as much as possible to make sure that the story is actually from the other person's point of view. And they can even guide you. I've been in situations where people that I was with, communities that I was in, they ended up actually doing a little bit of the photography themselves, but also helping me to see things in a slightly different way. So, this is prolonged. I'm not just talking about maybe like a single day, and I appreciate people won't always have that. But that prolonged communication with people, being in those communities, and for a lot of the times actually just being an observer instead of someone who's trying to capture whatever it is that they see. And that observation is also not just passive where I'm sitting back and I'm looking, but actively participating in what people are doing, getting a sense of what that means to people, and then maybe beginning to have a conversation around documenting that work. It usually helps. And you will get people who will probably actually help you a lot more than you thought they could have initially, if you hadn't done that. So I think those are some things that, when it comes to like narratives and just safeguarding the truthfulness or just the honesty of the narrative, photographers can do. Try not to just be superficial. Try not to get the first image and then let that be the whole story. Try and speak to people, try and engage them, even before you take a photograph if you can. And just try and shy away from your own biases, your own specific objectives, when it comes to your work.
Yeah, no, that's a great set of tips there, for any photographers that might be listening, and even those of us who just like to take photos, and aren't professionals.
Everybody's armed with a phone right now, so honestly,
iPhones revolutionized this.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I guess so. You've spoken a lot, it seems like, just about speaking to people, in terms of the people that you might be photographing before you even start taking their photos, and making sure that you are being truthful to whatever the narrative that is there, and being truthful to that. I guess I'm also thinking now about once the photographer has gone away, perhaps they are now back in the office, and they're sitting with the comms team, and they're trying to put something together. I think we spoke previously about biases, and how sometimes you can bring your own biases into that space. And I think you were saying how it's really important to avoid that singular look at things. Would you like to say something more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That is, I think, definitely in line with my own responsibilities as a photographer, or keeping myself accountable. So, what you're referring to there usually happens in contexts where, a photographer, generally speaking, has visited a place and has taken photographs of people and then has had to go away. And now they're doing work on the photographs, right? So one of the things that can happen there quite easily is that the cultures are very drastically different. And when I'm now sitting away from that context and I'm deciding what to do with all of this work that I've put together, I can miss out on a lot of very sensitive things culturally, just because, first of all, I'm probably not even from the place that I was photographing, right? So it's not a limitation. It's not to say, well, if you're not from the place, then you shouldn't be taking photographs or things of that nature. But how do you then become accountable? Not just to the people who you took the photograph of, but also in general, like whatever the story is that you're telling, is going to be far-reaching. So there has to be some sense of accountability in terms of what that story actually is. And one of the easy ways I think that people can just, as people would say, keep themselves in check is actually by having a community of other people, probably privately in this regard, because we are talking about culturally sensitive issues, but people who are probably very different from yourself. People will probably see things quite differently from how you're seeing them. People who you know that they're from different cultures from yourself, and just consulting to say, look, I've got this body of work. My intention is A, B, C, D. What do you guys think? And having an honest conversation about that, just to have an open look about the whole affair. And while entirely appreciating that whoever those people are, they don't know it all. They're giving you their insight, but they don't have a final word. And as we've said, the most preferable thing is actually to have that conversation with, first of all, the people who you're photographing. And then these people can help that, because in your now different context, there's a lot more probably that they can see that might go wrong with you using certain photographs, that probably even the subjects might not have been able to actually foresee. So I think it's that sense of having a community around you which can actually alert you to certain things that you might not be immediately aware of. It can definitely safeguard whatever it is that you're trying to do.
No, definitely. When you were talking, it was actually making me think about, how in the work we do at SSAP and HCA, and how we try and engage diaspora groups and bring people together for exactly what you're talking about, so that, you can actually speak to people who are familiar with maybe the context that you are working in, but like you said, might not know everything, but can still just assist you to show you, okay, that was maybe something that was actually quite significant that didn't look particularly important to you. Or maybe that's something to not show because in this particular culture, that might be a bit taboo and, that might not be respectful. So I think what you said about community is so, so, so important. And I feel like, this has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for speaking with me. I don't know if you've got any last word or last tip that you would like to share.
No, probably not last words, but likewise, this has been really great. And on the whole competition has been really great. My sincere hope is that people who are going to be either participating, whatever is to follow from the competition, they get a very informed sense of what is not just acceptable, but what's actually great. What are some examples of photographs that can do a lot of the things that we want them to do, but they are shown a little bit differently. And that's my hope when it comes to this idea of changing the narrative. So it's not just the narrative of the subjects, but also the narratives of the people who are actually doing this work. It is very important work. It matters how you do it. It really matters how you do it. So that's my genuine hope for when people do have a look at some of these photographs that we've put together from the competition.
Oh, wow. Thank you, Faith, for bringing us that interview. It was fantastic. Did you enjoy doing the interview?
It was good. It was such an insightful conversation. I feel like there were just so many points that we touched, so many things that I'm personally going to think about going forward, even in my own role around consent. It's a great discussion we had.
Awesome. Yeah, Takura is fantastic, isn't he? He's so eloquent in how he puts his point across. What was your biggest takeaway, do you think?
I think for me, my biggest takeaway is, planning ahead. I think that, like I said, the conversation touched on so many different points that I think in order to really think about consent and ensure that you are covering these many bases, I think it's important for people, for organisations to plan ahead, whether that's doing your research or speaking to the people prior. I think really just making sure that before you go into a situation or project, that you've really had to think through about consent and about how you will navigate it. And I also think as well, it's really important to think about the power dynamics in consent as well. Even though you can ask someone for consent, the power dynamics will typically be unbalanced. And so I think it's important for the people with the most power to ensure that they are asking whoever it is, or whether it's a group, asking them in a manner that ensures that they know there will be no repercussions if they say no. They will be able to rescind consent in future if they wanted to. I think ensuring that the power dynamics are also addressed is really important. I think those were my biggest takeaways personally. What were yours, Kath?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've got to agree with you about the time it takes. I think that's what's really come out of this project, and the work that we've been doing on reframing the narrative is it takes time to stop and reflect and think, doesn't it? So I totally agree with you about that. For me, I really enjoyed Takura talking about being conscious of the potential impacts of a picture. and talking about the responsibility of the photographer to think that through. And it made me think about how it's not only the responsibility of the photographer, particularly in our work and in the Wales Africa community, it's also thinking about, well, what's the responsibility of the charity or the group? So, as a charity, we need to think about the images that we're using and what stories they tell. And so I guess as a starting point, it would be being very clear with the photographer about your principles as an organisation and your procedures. So if you've done all this work into putting in clear guidance around informed consent, then making sure that your photographer is on board with that. And it might be a volunteer that you're working with. It might be one of your volunteers or one of your trustees that's doing the photography. And if that's the case, then making sure that they're fully aware and on board, and that there's somebody in country that can speak in the language that's appropriate for the community then that you're working with and the people in there, so that the consent is informed, in that there isn't any language barriers or other potential barriers to getting that. And then also we always take photos. If we're on trips, we always take photos. And sometimes volunteers like to share those images on social media. And so your thinking around informed consent and your thinking around dignity and respect in photography and storytelling isn't just limited to whoever does the cons and whoever does the fundraising pacts. It's everybody. It's all the volunteers. It's anybody who could be associated with your work or linked with the community, and helping them to understand, okay, so these are our principles and these are why, and this is the potential harm and this is what we're trying to avoid. You don't want to do all of this work and then somebody put an inappropriate photo on Facebook or something. And then, that brings us on to kind of how photographs capture stories. Takura talks about how the context of a moment that is captured in a photograph, how that can change over time. And I think that his advice is that there are potential problems, that those potential problems with how the context of a story changes over time, you can minimise that if you're cognizant of the story that you are trying to tell and the story that the community is trying to tell, and trying to make sure that the images tell the story that the person within the story wants to tell about themselves and is comfortable what that says about them and their community. Lots of conversations, basically. It just comes down to conversations. Talk to the people in your images, talk to your partners, talk about what it is you want to say, and if it's the right way to say it and the right thing to say, really. So, I really enjoyed that. Faith, thank you so much. Thanks for all the work that you've done on this, and for taking the time to meet Takura. It's a wrap. That's the end of our podcast. I want to thank Takura for giving us his time and for sharing his experiences. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who submitted their images. So this podcast is all about the Reframing the Narrative and the photography competition that we had about that, to do with that. So thank you to everybody who submitted their images. Thank you to the judges for their time and their expertise. And of course, congratulations to the winning photographs. Thanks, everyone. Bye.